You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Jim Clemente, retired FBI profiler and writer-producer on CBS's Criminal Minds and host of Real Crime Profile, and Laura Richards, behavioral analyst from New Scotland Yard and host of Real Crime Profile and Crime Analyst, here to talk about the FBI presser on January 8th about the new breaks in the Colonial Parkway murders cases. Jim and Laura, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thank you for having us.
Good to be here.
If you recall, we talked, Bill, back in 2016 about this case and about the murder of your sister and her girlfriend and 3 other double homicides that happened along the Colonial Parkway back in the late 80s.
And we'll link to those episodes of Real Crime Profile, and we can't thank the two of you enough for being here. We know your time is valuable, and your insight in particular, the two of you bring I don't know how many years worth of law enforcement experience to the table, but we can't thank you enough. This is one of those situations where our heads are spinning, quite frankly. This past Monday, January 8th, 2024, the Virginia State Police, FBI, and the Hampton, Virginia Police Department had a press conference. We ended up with probably far more questions than we received answers because we felt like the presentation was very confusing. Both of you had a chance to take a look at some of the press conference. What did you make of it?
I watched it and I tweeted about it immediately after texting you, Bill, and also looking for what you were saying about it, because I have to say I was confused. And it was a very confusing press conference. I couldn't quite work out why they weren't referring to the Colonial Parkway murders. They talked about the Isle of Wight murders, and they were referencing David Knobling and Robin Edwards, and it talked about another case that was linked to Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. And that was a great development to hear, that there was a suspect identified, that he was deceased, so it wasn't that this is a manhunt or a live investigation. It was, we are confirming that there is a suspect identified who was Alan Wade Wilmer Sr, age 63, but he died in 2017, and he was responsible, DNA confirmed, for the 1987 attack and murder of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, and there was a sexual component to the Robin Edwards case, and in 1989 he strangled, raped and murdered Teresa Howell, who was 29, and that happened in Hampton. So I hadn't heard of Teresa Howell before, so I was very curious about that case, but given its strangulation, rape and murder, my immediate question was about how many other victims are there? What about Kathy? What about Becky? What about all the other cases that we've discussed as part of the Colonial Parkway murders? It also made me think about what about Lolly Winans and Julie Williams that happened 10 years later, that I've talked about extensively on Crime Analyst and spoken to both of you about. But it was just very confusing. I felt there was some distance by the FBI in calling it the Isle of Wight murders, and it meant that people would be confused, because if I was confused and I knew about the case, what would that mean for the public? And it probably meant that other people didn't join the dots, and it didn't get as much attention as it should, because what they were trying to call upon was for the public to help timeline this very prolific perpetrator. So if your aim is to timeline someone, you put out accurate information. You're very clear. You want the public's help, so you have to create trust and confidence. You can't have people sat there thinking, hang on a minute, wait, is this part of this other series or what's going on? Because that's a distraction. So I was concerned, and I did want to know about Kathy and Becky, and they did say the investigation is ongoing. It's been ongoing for many decades.
Right.
Jim, I don't know how you felt. We talked in the morning that it was coming, and what did you think?
I spoke to Bill before the press conference, and so I had an idea of what was coming. And then what I saw of the press conference, I didn't see it coming. What I saw was confusion and obfuscation, and actually some things that I thought were outright wrong, incorrect. Like a statement that was made that because there was no felonies on Wilmer's record, that they couldn't legally collect DNA to test it against the DNA that was found in these murder scenes, which is, it's just an out and out bullshit lie. That's just not true at all. You don't need anything of the subject's criminal record. You don't need anything. He could be a stellar citizen, but you can grab his garbage because that's actually abandoned property, and you can test items in his garbage, or you could follow him, and when he discards a Coke can like they did in the Golden State Killer case, you can collect that and then get the DNA off of it, and then you can get a warrant to actually collect his DNA officially by doing a buccal swab, for example, and confirm it. But that's just wrong. That's just not true. They did not have to wait till he died. That sounded like a flimsy bullshit excuse to me. But the important thing is that not only was he tied to the murder of Teresa Howell, but also to the murder of two of the victims that have been classically identified as Colonial Parkway murder victims. And that was Robin Edwards and David Knobling. But there are still three other double homicides in that case. I don't know if this was they're obfuscating about the fact that the Knobling and Edwards cases were related to the Colonial Parkway murders. I don't know if they were trying not to mention it or harp on it because they didn't want to basically put words in people's mouths or get people who don't really know information to call in. I don't know if they were afraid of the hype or something, but it just, as you said, Laura, if you're actually looking for help to solve unsolved homicides, and they're in a series that everybody knows about in the area, and in fact, probably the nation, why would you avoid it? It just doesn't make any sense. Unless they're hiding something. Maybe they have more information and they want to hold it back. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but I hope that it's a legitimate law enforcement purpose and it isn't just incompetence at this point. Because, like you said, I left that press conference more confused about what was going on than when I started it.
Our listeners were the same way. We have over 20,000 followers on two different Facebook pages, Colonial Parkway Murders and Mind Over Murder, this podcast. And our listeners were so baffled. They were like, is this part of the Colonial Parkway Murders or not? And actually, the announcement that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. has been identified as the killer of these three individuals confirms that the Colonial Parkway Murders series is real and that this couple, Robin Edwards and David Knobling, we now have identified their killer. People were asking us, why are they calling this by another name? Even my partner Pamela, who is not following the case as closely as Kristin and I are, she finally watched the press conference with me about 10 p.m. that Monday night, and she said, why are they not calling this case by its proper name, the name that hundreds of thousands of people in the area know? Press people contacted us afterwards, and they were like, they didn't even make it clear what it was that they were going to talk about, which actually held down, reduced the number of press people who showed up for the press conference because it wasn't very clear what the heck it was they were going to be talking about that day.
Yeah, it was a mistake, and it is an anomaly to have a press conference led by a press liaison officer rather than by the lead law enforcement agencies that are involved in the investigation. I believe that they might have spoken later, but to lead off with just by a press officer It just, and then to refuse to answer specific questions about the investigation when you have a case that is clearly a deceased offender. There's no reason to be hiding the ball anymore when in solved cases. They said he would be charged if he were still alive. Then there's no reason to hide this stuff.
That was my reaction too, Jim, and I'm glad you used that expression, because I actually, when I finally got a chance to watch the press conference hours later, for reasons that we can get into, I said, why is the FBI playing hide the ball? They're deliberately, I believe, not being clear on what the heck it is we're talking about.
Well, Bill, I don't know if your conversations with the FBI or these other investigative agencies include more information about the case and the murder of your sister and some of these other Colonial Parkway murders. And I know if that's the case and you're not allowed to share, you're not allowed to share, and that's great. We'll certainly honor that. But the fact that they did not notify you that this press conference was going to happen, when clearly it is related to the Colonial Parkway murders and your sister's case, therefore, is an important part of this. And you, as one of the surviving, not only one of the surviving family members, but as one of the leading liaisons between law enforcement and the other families involved in the Colonial Parkway murders, you would think that you would be put high on the priority list in terms of official notification by law enforcement.
We received no notification whatsoever. Now, I want to be clear. The other families did receive notification. I pointedly did not. So Kristin, Dilley, and I were not informed. The other families were informed.
And when you say other families, you're talking about David Knobling and Robin Edwards. Their families were informed. They did know about what was coming.
And Teresa Howell.
And Teresa Howell.
And other Colonial Parkway murders families.
In addition?
Yes.
Yes.
In addition.
With the exception of yourself, which to me is just absolutely outrageous. I cannot understand how that could be a decision that is taken and then executed when you have been such a pivotal part, particularly being a spokesperson across. We spoke to you in 2016. We were the first to speak to you on Real Crime Profile about the case, and you always made sure you talked about the other families as well. And I just cannot understand why they would take that decision. And I'm horrified that you didn't know about the detail of what was coming, because you have to psychologically prepare yourself as well. It's not just about getting the information. It's about being psychologically prepared for what you're going to hear, what's going out to the public domain, what other people are going to hear, and what they're going to ask you about.
This very odd thing happened with our longtime case agent. I've been dealing with this agent for 10 years. I hold her in very high regard. She texted me at, I think it's about 7:30 on Monday morning. Now, I knew the press conference was coming. Kristin and I had received advance word from other media sources.
Media sources.
Yes,
Media
but
sources,
no one
yeah.
in law enforcement contacted us. I actually knew about the content of much of the press conference several months in advance, again, from a media contact. So I actually knew suspects' names and some of what was going to be said in January as early as October. And Kristin and I share information, of course. We wanted to be respectful of the process and not interfere with an active investigation. And no announcement was being made at that point. So Kristin and I committed that we weren't going to say anything to anyone, and we didn't. So we sat on this information for several months. Moving back to Monday morning, we received word, and Kristin reached out to me, and she said, there's going to be a press conference on Monday. And then a short while later, Kristin sent me some information, and even Kristin Dilley, who's an expert, she wrote to me via text and said, is this the press conference we were waiting for? It doesn't even mention the Colonial Parkway murders.
No.
And so the confusion started from that point, and then back to the outreach from my FBI agent. She reached out to me and texted me and asked me if I would be available to speak to her at 1:30 p.m. At this point, Kristin and I didn't know what time the press conference was. And the only reason I'm getting into this level of detail is she then set a time to talk with me 6 hours in advance, and we realized the press conference was going to be at the same time, I actually texted the agent back and said, is your intention for us to watch the press conference together? Because she set up this call for 1:30 p.m. Kristin comes back to me and says, it appears the press conference is at 1:30 p.m. Mm-hmm. I texted the agent back and said, is your intention we're supposed to watch this together? And she said no. So we had a fantastic, in-depth private briefing, some of the information, Jim, that I can't share at this point. As a family member and the brother of a murder victim, I do try to be respectful. I know they ding me on this every single time they can, but I do actually try not to be a source of information before it's appropriate. But we talked for 2 hours, the agent and I, but that was during the exact moment when the press conference was going on, and you think to yourself later, it's almost like they didn't want me to watch the press conference. Oh. Laura, you were saying you were trying to reach me, why was I radio silent? During the press conference, you were already texting about the conference.
Yes, I found it very odd, Bill, that I was trying to message you and putting stuff out on social media and seeing your reaction, because for me, I just found it confusing. I posted that on social media, just saying somewhat confusing presser, but a suspect has been identified. I wanted to get the information out there to help law enforcement, but I was very confused. I was very distracted by what we weren't hearing about and why it was being done in the way that it was. And now hearing that you were asked to speak at the exact time, it just feels intentional to me, and I feel really uncomfortable. I've been grinding my teeth. I hope listeners haven't heard that on the microphone, but just hearing you say those things, I've been grinding my teeth, and I find it maddening, because you could have that conversation with her at any other point, and you have been a trusted person across all of this time. You've always been respectful, in my opinion, and when there are things that cannot be discussed, you're very clear about that. So on the day that is so important for you to hear information, you don't get the heads up about what's coming out, but then your time is being monopolized at the exact time the rest of the world are hearing what's going on. I don't know, Jim. It just feels really uncomfortable.
It feels deliberate, and I think I have some clarity on it based on what Bill said and what you just said, Laura, and what Kristin said. I believe that it is probably a deliberate attempt to keep Bill and Kristin from making any kind of public statements about this case, that this FBI agent was not authorized or didn't want to say anything to Bill until it was actually made public. So that's why she started the call at the same time as the press conference, and that they singled out Bill as one of the family members and didn't give him any advance warning of that the press conference was going to happen, or that what it was going to contain. They didn't want to give him any of that information in advance, because they know he does a podcast and he does speak publicly about this case. He wants to keep it in the public's mind so that it puts pressure on law enforcement to continue working the case. But he's always totally respectful in terms of when they say this can't go out, he doesn't let it go out. And so they shouldn't have put him in this category. They should have treated him like the other victims' family members, and he should have been at least given some advance notice, not only of the press conference, but advance notice of what it would contain, so that he would be able to prepare, as you said, Laura, because this is a serious life event. This is not just a game, and I don't like the fact that it appears that she was playing games.
The whole thing just feels very contrived and really very manipulative. And as Bill and I were speaking, fortunately, my schedule at school allowed me to be off at a time when I could go home and run this presser through my computer, and then I could start doing all the social media stuff that we do. And I called Bill as I was speeding my way home to get here to watch this press conference. And we were debating, do we maybe let the FBI agent's call go to voicemail so that he can watch the presser? Like, how are we going to deal with that? And ultimately, we decided it's better for him to take that call. And I can always watch the press conference, which I did, and record it and transcribe it, send it to him later. But I really don't like the fact that Bill was put in that position, because as you said, Jim, it's a major life event for him, and he needed to be able to watch it in real time and process it and ask questions. And I think the reason that she had him on the phone was so that he couldn't watch and couldn't ask questions at that point.
And the weird thing is, I've been dealing with this agent for 10 years, and normally she texts me, and we've talked, I don't know if it's hundreds, but it's probably, we talk a lot, and she's been incredibly helpful and hardworking and dedicated. Our usual MO is she texts me and says, can we talk? And I do my damnedest to stop what I'm doing and call her immediately, and a 5-minute turnaround kind of thing, because she's a very important person in my world. She has information, not every single time, but she tells me what's going on with my sister, Kathy Thomas, Rebecca Dowski, and the other Colonial Parkway murder victims, what's going on, and especially with Kathy and Becky. So for her to reach out to me first thing in the morning to set up a call at 1:30 p.m., even at the moment I received the text, and I wrote back and said, yes, of course. I thought to myself, since when are we setting up calls 6 hours in advance?
Bill, I just think it was deliberate. I think that a decision was made somewhere. I don't know if it was her decision or above her or in another agency to keep you in the dark until that moment. And that's why she called you. And that's why she spent 2 hours on the phone with you, so that you could get this information. But she deliberately did not want, or somebody deliberately did not want you to have any information at all about this press conference or about what they were going to say in advance. I think that's what it boils down to.
I'll just weigh in that you're not the enemy here, and I think that needs to be made clear. You've never been the enemy. You've always been the person that's been respectful. Everything I've seen of you over the years that I've known you, you've always been very respectful of information and what goes out and when. And I do think trust and confidence works both ways. That if you want to create trust and confidence, you have to put it into that person too. And I think that is unfortunately not the right way to do it, and to put you in the dark of what other people are absorbing and understanding and put you on the back foot. That really doesn't work well. And I think the whole press conference unfortunately didn't really work well, because the timeline, you're trying to get information out from the public. You want information from them to timeline this individual, but there were just so many question marks as to what one of the media people asked. Can you explain how Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. became known to you? No, said the press officer. And it was an immediate shutdown, and it was stark. And look, there are times when you have to control information and the flow of information, but let's be clear, this perpetrator is deceased. He is not alive. It's not about compromising a manhunt or an investigation that's ongoing at this point. They're trying to rely on the public and on both of you, the same as us. Why we want to talk about the case is to amplify it, to make sure that people know about Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. They know about who he is, that he was on the water, he was a waterman, he was a hunter, he had a truck, and we'll go into all of that. But we want to put that information out there. You don't want people to be puzzled or distracted by these other things going on. But I sense, my read of it, why this press conference happened in this way is because there's some real ugly horror stories that lurk behind it, i.e., a man like Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. does not, at the age of 33, just start attacking two people who are together, David and Robin, and sexually assault Robin, and that is never going to be the first offence. So there's going to be lots of things that he most likely did before, and lots of things that, and we know about one potential murder, and of course there's information and there's intelligence, but we do know about other cases that he was, and one in particular where he was the prime suspect. And if that's what they're guarding, unfortunately they have to be more transparent. Being more transparent actually increases trust and confidence from the public. It increases trust and confidence from the families. This is my experience of 27 years working with families who say, we know sometimes human error happens. We know sometimes you get things wrong, right? But if you try and hide it, if you cover things up, that does not sit well. And the cover up is worse than the actual event itself. That's my experience of working with hundreds and hundreds of families. So I can understand that you might feel on the back foot of things, and I'm really sorry that happened, because you don't deserve that, actually, Bill. You've been a really incredible and tremendous spokesperson for not just your sister, not just an advocate for Kathy and Becky, but for all the families. And I've always thought incredibly highly of you for that. You've been a tremendous advocate. So I'm sorry that there seems to be some kind of strategy to keep you in the dark and to monopolize your time. I don't think that's helpful at all in this case.
I was on a conference call with the FBI investigators a couple of years ago, and I get exasperated from time to time, and I'm not proud of that, and my mom wouldn't be terribly proud of me either. But I got so exasperated on one of those calls, I actually said to this group of FBI investigators, since when does the brother of the murder victim become the enemy? Because that's sometimes how they treat me.
Yeah. It shouldn't be, and that's why there should be a liaison officer that has your well-being and your information as one of their priorities. And it's irresponsible and not necessary. The thing is that obviously the information that you get from law enforcement isn't just information to you. It isn't just news like it is to the general public. This is your family. Your sister was brutally murdered and you still don't have answers. And every person in law enforcement should understand your need to know. So it's just very unfortunate.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. I want to focus on something positive, which Kristin and I are trying to strongly support. Mm-hmm. They have put out some pretty good information about Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. As Laura was saying, he drove a very distinctive truck. He had a very distinctive boat, the Denny Wade. It was a fishing boat with a big graphic on the side. He himself is a physically very distinctive man. He's got average looks with a neatly trimmed beard, and they had really good age progression of photographs, which I think might be Virginia driver's license pictures, but they were really good. You could see what he looked like back in the 80s all the way back through to age 63 when he passed. One thing I think they missed, though, was he's a very distinctively short individual. He's 5 foot 5 inches tall, which I think is 5 inches less than the average man. He's very muscular, so I almost picture a dude that looks like Popeye the Sailor Man driving this very distinctive truck. It's got a very distinctive boat, and then he himself has these very distinctive physical characteristics. What Kristin and I are trying to do on Mind Over Murder is really push out on our podcast, but especially on our social media platforms, Mind Over Murder and Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook and other platforms, these photographs and this information, because the Virginia State Police and the FBI now are asking for help. They're trying to timeline this man, especially back in the 1980s when these murders were happening, and they're asking people to come forward. One of the things that Kristin and I are trying to do is people are commenting and telling stories, including some scary stories about Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., and we're trying to push those folks respectfully. Don't just talk about it to Bill and Kristin on a social media page, or don't just post it on your own page. Please get this information to law enforcement.
Call the FBI or the state police, Virginia State Police hotlines. But also, Bill, we should focus on the offender's behavior, because Laura and I, this is what we do. This is our bread and butter. And we would expect that this guy had a number of precursor crimes that were committed in the late 70s, early 80s. Crimes like stalking and peeping and maybe breaking and entering or harassing people. And these kinds of things may many times be dismissed as unimportant by the public, and they may sometimes be dismissed as unimportant by the police, but they are incredibly important to build the timeline of this guy and his offenses. As I think Laura said earlier, again, he didn't just start at the age of 33 abducting, raping, and killing people. He actually started earlier, probably in his late adolescence, and he was probably committing these kind of precursor crimes. these are things that are important. So if you have any history of interacting with this guy, this 5'5" guy named Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., and whether it's in your neighborhood or in a business dealing or on the water or in his tree service company or on the road, anything that you might have to tell the police about him and his behavior, all of that is incredibly important. We would all encourage you to call the FBI tip line or the state police email tip line so that you can put this information into official records so that then they can build a better timeline.
And even if you've reported it, please re-report it, because often these things get lost. And as Jim said, extensive experience of working these cases, oftentimes those who are peeping toms or loitering or standing near you, leering at you, making you feel uncomfortable, or obscene phone calls, exposing yourself, these sorts of things can oftentimes be not just ignored by you and you minimize it and think it's not anything major, but it's a gateway crime to something much more serious, and often it is minimized by law enforcement. And I will say particularly male officers, because often it will not happen to them. And therefore they don't understand how terrifying it is when you're a lone female and that happens to you. And this guy being along the waterway, we did talk about Kathy and Becky and did the perpetrator have a boat, for example? We did discuss that specifically, didn't we? Mm-hmm. So again, it's really interesting how transient he was, but he did have anchor points and he did use the boat. He was a hunter. Hunting equals stalking. He had a tree service business, so that means he's part of the street furniture. He could be somewhere and people don't necessarily think, this guy. So it seems to me that he used all of these things in the commission of his offences. And I think it's really important that people do put that information back into the FBI or Virginia State Police. And the other thing to say is that when I was listening to that press conference, yes, I believed that he had an extensive history and he would have had contact with law enforcement. And then it became known. I read Blaine Pardue's blog that he recently put out about the book and about him. And his book's a special kind of evil. I know you know the book well, but page 204, he talked about Wilmer being a prime suspect in the Cassandra, Hailey and Keith Cool murders in April 1988. That for me was just exactly what I see so often in cases where a suspect is overlooked, even though there were some very important behaviors and information about him. And one of those things, and we talked about this with Kathy and Becky, how the perpetrator approached them. We heard from Blaine Pardue that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was approaching couples in cars along the parkway. He was aggressive. He was confronting them. He was banging on windows. One particular event, he bangs on the window. He thinks it's two women together, but it's actually a guy and a woman. The guy had long hair and he turns around, but he said, "Are you girls having fun?" And then when he sees it's a bloke, he then backs off. These are exactly the types of behaviors that we would expect as precursors. And his truck was called in to law enforcement. These events were called into law enforcement. And after Cassandra and Keith went missing, he was under surveillance. And there was drive-by surveillance going on. And actually, law enforcement turned up, spoke to him when he was spray painting his truck and vacuuming and cleaning it out and painting it. They felt that he was a prime suspect. They went off and got a warrant because they wanted to search his trailer. And in the trailer, they find weapons, handcuffs, pornography. These are all things that Jim and I would see as absolute critical information, red flag behavior. And a witness also placed him at the scene where Cassandra and Keith went missing. So they've got a four-pronged approach, if you will, and four-pronged key behaviors about this individual. And they bring in a polygrapher, an experienced polygrapher, who they say eliminated him as not being involved in the murder. I just find that absolutely staggering, given all that we know. And we can put ourselves back in time and say maybe it wasn't as well known about stalking and predatory behavior and sexual violence, serial killers and so forth. But I got to say, even on a basic level, Jim, of being a police officer or detective. These things should have raised red flags, and it should never have been, let's eliminate him based on a lie detector test.
I think actually, to credit the FBI agents at the time, they actually felt like he was a good suspect and continued to feel that way, even though he got washed out. But I will say this, Bill, that behavior that Laura just outlined with that one couple in their car where he banged on the window and said, "Are you girls having fun?" and then was startled to find that one of them was a guy, and then he took off. I think that's a direct tie to your sister Kathy and Becky's case. The fact that he would approach a car with two girls in it and then retreat when he found out it was a girl and a guy. To me, your sister and her girlfriend were in that car together, and they were in their car together, and this could very well be how he approached. At that point, banging on the door, your sister may have lowered the window, or may have told him to get out of there, and that could have been the beginning. I mean, the fact that he had weapons, that he was a hunter. We know that he had knives because he used a knife to kill them. We also believed that he had guns because he was able to control two adults who would have fought back. But by controlling one person in a couple, you can then control the other. In other words, you can threaten one person, and if the other person does anything, then that person, the first person, will be killed. And that is a good way to threaten a couple.
He had weapons and handcuffs, Jim.
And handcuffs, which, yeah, we all thought that at the point that during the course of the murders of your sister and her girlfriend, that there was a high likelihood that he had controlled one of them first and threatened her, and then got her tied up somehow, and then went after the other one. Obviously, handcuffs are a way to do that, to accomplish that. And the fact that he had those cuffs should have been incredibly important to the investigators, and may very well be why he was able to pull off these double homicides.
What's shocking, though, and what was baffling to Kristin and me and the other Colonial Parkway Murders families was none of this was mentioned at the press conference. As you mentioned, Laura, when a reporter asked, when did this man, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., move on to law enforcement's radar, they refused to answer the question. Now, he was suspect number one. That's what the agents called it, in the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey. And somehow that was never covered in this press conference. So this is a situation where those of us that are close to the details of the Colonial Parkway murders, which I know is not most people, those of us that know some of the detail, and we don't claim to be as expert as law enforcement, we're all looking at each other after we finally have a chance to watch the press conference. We're like, what the heck was that? And why don't they mention the fact that Wilmer was suspect number one in Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey's disappearance?
Well, Bill, all I can say is I just hope that's because they have positive information about a connection and that they don't want to release it yet, but they're going to plan on releasing it soon. I just hope that's the reason. Because if it's not, it's just irresponsible, because we do want to find out if they're connected. And if people are out there and have information that would connect it to Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey's murders, then they should be calling for people to do that. And it's just, it's ridiculous to not call for people to do that when we know that he was a prime suspect in that very double homicide.
And the murders were 2 years apart. We're not talking about in different parts of the world, different countries. We're talking about in the same geographic region. And that's what's staggering to me, that it makes me feel uncomfortable that they're hiding things. And if you say, no, I'm not going to talk about it, you can't be caught later on, you can't be caught out. So that's how I felt about it. And I hope, Jim, in good faith, that they're holding things back because it's a key part of the investigation. I really hope that's true. But let's not forget, this guy is deceased. Mm-hmm. This isn't about anything other than this guy's dead. Let's properly timeline him. And they should be trying to create trust and confidence in the public that we're trying to do our job and we need your help. And it should just be straight up, clear what's required. And they should be saying the truth. I don't understand why they would hold that back. And this geographic area, Bill, when we've spoken before, you said that his house was where he died was in his house in Lancaster County. And I think you mentioned that it was an hour and 15 minutes away from the Colonial Parkway murders, but I wonder what that would be by boat. I assume you were thinking by car, or were you thinking by boat? And would it be easily accessible by boat?
It would still be a lengthy bit of travel by boat. We understand now that Wilmer lived on his boat and docked it in Gloucester and Hampton, Virginia. And as Kristin can tell you, these places are minutes away. So apparently he'd come down for the oystering season and he would park his boat and then work that area. That's actually something Virginia State Police and FBI are looking for information if anyone docked their boat near his.
So that boat would be the Deni, D-E-N-I, Wade, W-A-D-E. And it's a wooden boat, so it would be distinctive, as well as his car, which is the 1966 Dodge Fargo pickup truck that's blue-green in color with the license plate E-M-R-A-W. Anybody who was around that area at that time or on the water at that time who interacted with him in any way, even if it was totally insignificant in your mind, it may be important. Putting him in a particular place at a particular time, giving him access to these victims that we know were murdered in cases that are still unresolved.
It's worth also just pointing out that he was married. He had 2 children. And it's always, a lot of my work has been centered around interviewing the ex-wives and understanding from the partners and ex-wives, the children, those who know that individual the best. They can really add information into the case. And it really concerned me when I heard from Kerry Rawson, who is the daughter of Dennis Rader. Jim, when I was at the FBI, I spent a lot of time talking to the agents involved in the Dennis Rader case. People know him by his horrible moniker, which I'm not going to use. But Kerry, when I interviewed her, told me so much about what was going on behind closed doors. And actually, she told me the FBI never interviewed her about what was happening in terms of the domestic violence, the coercive control, that they were victims too. And I remember distinctly asking the agents at the time, does he have a history of domestic violence? What was going on in terms of his wife, his children? And they said nothing. There was no abuse. And Kerry couldn't believe it. That's what I was told. So again, we now know about coercive control. We now know these are power and control related crimes. And so it's really important that I hope law enforcement are speaking to the family in order to find out more about the timeline, specifically places. Kerry told me all this information about Dennis Rader of places she went with him, who now she thinks he was stalking other victims. That intelligence and information is so important in the timeline. So it is worth saying there may be other girlfriends, ex-girlfriends that we don't know about. But they're really important of building a picture of this individual, because I have no doubt he would be prolific, absolutely prolific, because of the fantasy base of his levels of perpetration. And I know it's not just him either, it's his brother too. And there are some very key pieces of intelligence about Keith Wilmer, the brother. So again, there's been some confusion in some cases about which brother might be involved. Therefore, if you know anything about Keith Wilmer or Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., then please do make sure you forward that information to law enforcement.
Jim and Laura, while I have you here, I did want to ask about an important, interesting piece of information that SAC Brian Dugan put forward at the end of his time at the podium. He did give all of the information that they are looking for with regard to Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. He also gave all of the tip line numbers, but he ended with an interesting coda, and I wanted to get your thought on it. So I'm going to quote from SAC Dugan here. He said, "We recognize relationships and loyalties change over time, as do people and their perspectives. There are occasions where people who may have had knowledge of a crime do not feel comfortable coming forward with information. This may have been due to relationships with the persons involved or out of concern for their own safety, reputation, or standing amongst friends. Even though Mr. Wilmer is deceased, we want you to know it is not too late to come forward." Who might he be speaking to? Would that be the brother, the ex-wife? Who is this?
So all of them.
Family members, relatives, the people that he was in a relationship with, people who lived next door to him, who might have been afraid of him, people who worked with him, people who just interacted with him socially, everybody, what they're trying to say is, look, back in the day, maybe you had some kind of loyalty to him. He's not around anymore, and we know he is a serial killer, so please come forward. That's, I think, what they're trying to say there, and I think it's really important that anybody out there, especially people who are related to him, who could help, would be doing the world a great service, and if they don't help, they'd be doing the world a great disservice, and the victims and their families.
And perpetrators like him are frightening. They are terrifying, and they terrify and terrorize the people in their intimate lives too. So oftentimes when someone stays quiet, it's out of fear, actually. Sometimes it might be loyalty, yes, but oftentimes I see with domestic violence and coercive control, it's fear. And then, unfortunately, it gets into being concerned about judgment. Why didn't you come forward earlier? And then feeling like you might be blamed or judged. And I always say, absolutely not. Why would you be blamed or judged? It's not your actions. You won't be held responsible for somebody else's behavior. And I say that very clearly because oftentimes people do hold women accountable for men's behavior. This is a very prolific and dangerous man, and I have no doubt he would have used coercive tactics on other people around him. And he would have been probably quite frightening to be around, but maybe he has charm too. And the charm ability, we mustn't overlook that either. So yes, I would imagine family members do know some things. They may not know all of it, and it sounds like he died a lonely death in a house on his own where no one's saying, oh, we miss him, or he didn't turn up for X or Y. So it sounds like there's some distancing in the family there. I don't know why, but that could be part of the story here.
Kristin, do you mind giving that tip information before we go?
Absolutely. For anyone who has tips regarding Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., please call 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. You can also contact the Virginia State Police via email at questions@vsp.virginia.gov.
And we'll include that information in our show notes for Mind Over Murder.
Jim and Laura, it has been a real pleasure and a privilege having you here on Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your time. And I hope that there's more good news to come because this is your life, Bill. And I know you want your sister's case and Becky's, all of them resolved. And I feel that the answers are there. So I hope next time we talk, there'll be better news for you as well. And I am sorry about the way that you've been treated because even now you're trying to get information to help law enforcement. And I applaud you for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.